President Donald Trump has pressed his Japanese counterpart, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, to even out what he refers to as a trade imbalance with the United States.
With regards to North Korea, Trump says he is in no rush to reach a peace deal but is happy with how things are going. The US and Japanese leaders addressed a news conference following a summit talks earlier today.
I personally think that
Trump seemed at pains to play down tensions in the world's two most pressing flashpoints as the US faces increasingly antagonistic regimes in Iran and North Korea. His goal, he says, is to remove trade barriers and put US exports on a fair footing in Japan. He said he hoped to have more to announce on trade very soon, adding that he and Abe had agreed to expand cooperation efforts in human space exploration.
The United States and Japan are also working to improve our economic relationship based on the principles of fairness and reciprocity. We are currently negotiating a bilateral trade agreement that would benefit both of our economies. Our goal is to reduce our trade deficit with Japan, remove trade barriers and barriers of all kinds, so that U.S. exports will really have a fair and very profound footing.
条件をつけずに金正恩委員長と会って率直に
Shinzo says during today's meeting, President Trump and I have agreed that we must accelerate our discussions through our strong trusting relationship to achieve fast results that would be a win-win for both Japan and the US.
あらゆる支援を惜しまないとの力強い指示をいただきました。
Trump also seemed optimistic that North Korea would follow through with its plans to give up its nuclear program. He also reiterated his assertions that he is not bothered by its recent missile tests.
I'm in no rush at all. The sanctions remain. We have our hostages back. We, as you know, are getting the remains, continuing to get the remains. A lot of good things are happening. And very importantly, there's been no nuclear testing for 2 years.
The Japanese Prime Minister described missile launches as regrettable and a violation of United Nations resolutions. Shinzo also raised a point of concern, the kidnapping of Japanese citizens.
条件をつけずに
Shinzo says, I want to have an unconditional heart-to-heart talk with Chairman Kim Jong-un to resolve the issue of Japanese citizens kidnapped by North Korea decades ago. This is a burning domestic issue.
私の決意に対し
President Trump said he would back the idea and do whatever is needed. He also expressed his strong support for Shinzo's decision. On the even tougher trade negotiations with China, Trump suggested there was a very good chance for a favorable deal with China.
They would like to make a deal. We're not ready to make a deal, and we're taking in tens of billions of dollars of tariffs. And that number could go up very, very substantially, very easily. But I think sometime in the future, China and the United States will absolutely have a great trade deal. And we look forward to that.
The trade war between the world's two largest economies has hurt markets worldwide and confounded US allies, including Japan and the European Union, although those allies share US concerns about Chinese practices. Lehana Tsotetsi, SABC News.
For more on this, we're joined on the line by independent analyst Christopher Gilmour. A very good evening to you, Mr. Gilmour. Thank you so much for joining us. The American president's state visit comes amid tensions with Japanese car maker Toyota over potential auto tariffs. Is there a cause for concern here?
Yes and no. You know, I was at the CFA conference in London a couple of weeks ago, and a geopolitical analyst called Robert Zion gave a very good rundown as to what's actually happening in the New World Order. You know, ever since 1945, the Americans have kind of played the global policeman. Well, they're changing all that now. They're not really prepared to do that anymore. That's the first point. And secondly, if you look at trade as a percentage of GDP, America has one of, if not the lowest ratios of any country in the world. So they can hang out for an awful long period of time. Whether it's Japan with Toyota, whether it's China, doesn't actually matter because trade doesn't really matter an awful lot to America. It's not a trading nation. It's very much a closed economy. Their internal economy is so massive that they don't really need to trade. So that's why I say they can do a kind of Mexican standoff with so many countries, and they've done it with Mexico, they've done it with Canada, they've done it with other countries in Europe. And, it's a strange one. I think markets have got a bit concerned about this, as you pointed out just now. But I think if you just scratch the surface and you realize that the Americans really do have the upper hand, not just in terms of trade, but militarily as well. In terms of military might, no country, not even in China, is even remotely close to that of America. It will take the rest of the world over 200 years to catch up to where America is today. So I think to try and condense this, I think the Americans are holding, and no pun intended, all the trump cards here. As far as trade negotiations are concerned, they're using trade really as an economic weapon. And if I was a betting person, I would say they're going to win.
And in the center of all of this, Mr. Gilmour, is the markets. I mean, the markets are very sensitive to sentiments. And having said that, is the United States taking a hawkish posture in its trade relations with its trade partners?
Oh, very much so. Very hawkish indeed. As I say, they can afford to tough it out for a long, long time because of the fact that they just don't trade, because they don't need to trade. So any tariffs that get imposed on a retaliatory basis by any country, including China, against America, doesn't really make an awful lot of difference. So as I say, they can afford to, to tough it out. They can have a hawkish attitude for a long, long time. Robert Zion, the chap I just mentioned now, reckons that the Japanese will probably cave by the end of the summer, and we'll have a trade deal in place with America by then. Excuse me. And listening to the little clip you played earlier, it'll probably be a trade deal that is seen to be far more accommodating towards the Americans and far less one-sided than it currently is, and less of a deficit as far as the Americans are concerned. And I think the same thing will happen with China. It'll just take longer to achieve it. But you're right, it's a very hawkish approach, and I think they're going to perpetuate that hawkish approach for the foreseeable future.
Mr. Gilmour, no doubt the relations between both countries are quite cordial. As a matter of fact, it is reported that President Trump was in Japan, in actual fact, to show off the relation between both countries. So is this so-called bromance between President Trump and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe will it stand the test of time? I mean, I'm reading into threats that President Trump made that he was going to impose much higher tariffs on Japan if both countries don't iron out differences emanating from the $60 billion trade deficit with Japan.
Yes, I mean, that's a very good point you make, and that's a good way of putting it. And as I said a moment ago, I think what Trump is doing, and more importantly, the Trade Secretary, a fellow called Robert Lighthizer, he's the guy in the background who's doing all the trade negotiations. They're using trade as a weapon. So they're coming along and they're saying, well, if you don't like this, we'll just bump the tariffs up. And so they're playing hardball to the nth degree, and it seems to be working.
I mean, President Trump himself did concede that Japan has quite a substantial advantage in trade over the United States. Is this what the real issue is here? I mean, the United States seeing any other country with a bigger advantage when it comes to trade, seeing it as a threat? Well, if you look at what he did last year, Canada was an interesting one. Now, Canada is a fairly small population. It's right beside the U.S. But America sees that as a kind of threat because it's got a similar type of demographics. And they gave the Canadians an ultimatum. They gave them 7 days to come to heel. They caved in after 6. So to answer your question, Japan has got very, very aging demographics. They're seen as being a competitive threat to America. And they've had this deficit with the Japanese for a long, long time. They want to iron that deficit out. They want to make it more favorable to America. And the Japanese aren't stupid. You know, they've enjoyed a very, very good advantage for many, many years, if not decades. So I think they're prepared to bite the bullet, so to speak, and take the medicine and understand that if they want to carry on in a fairly cordial arrangement with the Americans, then they're going to have to sit down and take the kind of medicine that the Americans are currently doling out. Well, Japan's long-term strategy of showering Trump with affection in hopes of extracting benefits, but apparently President Trump wasn't so impressed with the concessions despite a program tailor-made for the president that included, a show of force when it comes to trade. In the long term, what does this mean?
In the long term, I think, as I said a moment ago, Japan is definitely going to cave. I've got no doubt about it. They can't do anything but cave in and accept the conditions that the Americans put down. Because, we've mentioned military might. The Japanese probably see themselves in a fairly vulnerable position if they want to carry on getting American protection, particularly in Southeast Asia. They're going to have to kowtow to what the Americans ask for. So there's always that military threat overhanging them. And as far as the trade situation is concerned, as I said before, they're using that as a weapon. And they're definitely playing hardball. The Americans are not going to concede. They're not going to give in. This is not a rerun of the book that Trump wrote years ago called The Art of the Deal, where he puts a kind of very brave face in it and then comes and starts being much more relaxed about it. No, this is a very, very different type of approach altogether in this new world order that I was talking about. So whether it's Japan, whether it's China, whether it's Europe, he's probably going to be turning his sights on Europe next in terms of trade and tariffs. I think every single trading bloc in the world is going to realize that the Americans really do mean business and that if they want a trade deal with the U.S., it's going to come at a price, and a significant price.
All right, Mr. Gilmour, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. That was independent analyst Christopher Gilmour.